There are houses in America where the walls do not allow the past to sleep, and when you stand before them at night, you can feel the breath of what was left behind. The air seems to thicken as if someone else is sharing the same corner of the room. In a quiet lane in 1927, the lights went out in a family home and never came back for those inside. And decades later, the same hallway still smells faintly of boiled cabbage and old blood to anyone brave enough to cross its threshold. Today, we will walk through 12 chilling murder homes in America that no one dares to approach. Houses where crime, rumor, and reported hauntings overlap until the facts and the folklore become indistinguishable. Each story is anchored to a place, a year, a family name, physical evidence, and the reactions of neighbors and professionals. We will listen to witnesses, read the records, and stand with investigators who tried to reconcile missing pieces. These houses are not simply buildings, they are archives of trauma, and they remind us that some violence refuses to be filed away. What you will hear is not all speculation, and it is not all proof either. It is a ledger of events and sensations that together form a pattern, a faint map toward understanding why some homes keep calling. The first house we enter sits in the waning light of the Midwest, an unadorned clapboard dwelling on Maple Street that once belonged to the Whitaker family. And the night that changed everything is one people still whisper about at their kitchen tables. Ambient sound suggestion, low bowed strings with a slow undercurrent of distant, airy whispers. Music swells on reveal, then falls to a low tone for narration. At the Whitaker house in Keene, Iowa, 1934, a single scream turned a domestic evening into a crime scene. And the small town awake overnight watched as policemen carried out a case that would leave unanswered questions for generations. The Whitaker parents, Henry and Mabel, were found dead in their beds, strangled and posed in a way the medical examiner called ritual-like, while their son Thomas was missing for 3 days, only to return with scraped palms and a memory he refused to give. The neighbors heard a truck that night, someone said, and another voice claimed to have seen a figure in a long coat moving away from the property. Sheriff Mark Harlow remembers the damp air and the way the porch glowed under a single kerosene lamp, and he would later tell reporters that the house had a smell that would not leave the clothes of the men who worked the scene. In the kitchen, a cast-iron skillet had been left heating on the stove until it slicked with oil, and a brass key disappeared from the family chest. The Whitaker backstory begins in 3 parts, a portrait in tension and ordinary life that ends in violence. Henry Whitaker, born in 1892 in a neighboring county, built his life on small trades and louder promises. He carried the faint smell of cigarette smoke into rooms and the habit of tapping his fingers on tables when he was thinking, and he loved maps and the idea of routes and orders. His marriage to Mabel was not a refuge, but a partnership of 2 people who both worked too hard at things no one else noticed, a curt affection that had weathered droughts and harvests. Mabel kept her hair in tight waves and her pantry in jars labeled with hand scrawls, and she believed in church carpets and in being seen as tidy. Their son Thomas learned to read before he could tie his shoes, spent afternoons disassembling clocks, and spoke little at family gatherings. 3 months before the murders, Henry took out a small loan to repair a pickup truck, and he began keeping a ledger book that he hid beneath a loose floorboard in his workshop. The ledger contained names, dates, and a note about a payment owed in the spring. People who knew them remember Sunday dinners and the way Henry would whistle under his breath while Mabel arranged napkins. After the crime, investigators found a single footprint in the garden, a print that did not match any known shoe in town, and neighbors like Rosa Alvarez, who lived 2 doors down, described how the air had been heavy that night, as if it resisted being entered. Dialogue at the scene is preserved in witness statements and in their tone. Sheriff Harlow to June Mercer, the reporter, 4 exchanges as the tape recorder runs. Harlow asks, "What did you see?" And June answers, "I saw a light and then nothing." Harlow counters, "Did you hear anyone?" And June replies, "Just the wind or something like it." Harlow presses, "And the boy Thomas, did he say anything?"
June says he only whispered there was someone under the floor. The sound of exchange lingers like steps on old boards, and a sense of someone being close but not seen becomes part of the evidence. That evidence was handled with the care and limitations of small-town forensics of the 1930s. The medical examiner recorded asphyxia as the cause of death, with bruises shaped by fingers, and a cloth with faint oil stains was bagged and stored in a linen closet at the county records office. Forensic description, simplified, notes that strangle marks and petechial hemorrhaging were consistent with manual strangulation, and fibers from the cloth suggested a domestic origin, though they also included a rare synthetic thread then uncommon in local industry, which puzzled technicians. The family chest that had been sealed for generations was opened in sunlight and photographed, a single brass key missing from its ring. Over the years, the Whitaker house acquired stories that blurred with the facts. Visitors reported hearing a man humming in the east bedroom, tasting metallic tangs on their tongues in the hallway, and
feeling pressure like a hand pressing down on their shoulders while no one was behind them. On one November night in 1961, a teenager named Sam Bennett snuck into the house with friends. He later said, dialogue with his friend Marcus on the porch was 4 exchanges that seemed to have been more like a dare than a conversation. Sam said, "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Marcus answered, "Yes, we will only stay 10 minutes. Sam asked, "What if something happens?" Marcus waved and said, "Nothing happens in old houses," until a sound from inside made both go silent. They felt the dust on the windowsill, the cold metal of the porch railing under their palms, the smell of damp wood, and something sweet. Sam swore later to the sheriff that the sound was like a piano being played from the basement, though the house had no piano. The Whitaker case was never solved. The town elected to board up the windows in 1972 and argued about whether to demolish the structure in 1980, but a legal dispute about the deed and the presence of artifacts found on the property kept it standing long enough that several families complained about a shadow that sometimes looked out their windows at night. The next house is a brick townhouse in a coastal New England village called Alder Point, where in 1948 the Harrington family faced a double homicide that left a bed soaked in lemon oil and a portrait burned at the edges. The Harrington house's backstory is 3 paragraphs that show an economic ascension and private frictions. Jonathan Harrington arrived from a nearby port and invested in a small shipping company. He dressed in navy coats and kept a ledger of ships and surnames. His wife, Clara, an amateur pianist, kept the home neat and her temper quieter than her playing. Their daughter Elsie played with keys and padlocks and once hid a love letter inside a Bible. The Harringtons' rise brought them into the circle of the town's elites, but Jonathan also began traveling and returning with the smell of sea salt and rum in his coat. Clara took to locking the bedroom door at night, and Elsie began sleepwalking, waking with the sheets twisted and her hair smelling faintly of smoke. News clippings from April 1948 record that the Harringtons were killed by blunt force trauma, that a fireplace poker was found with traces of blood, that the portrait on the upstairs wall of an ancestor had been burned and pinprick holes marked across the canvas as if someone had tried to remove the eyes. A neighbor, Lydia Quinn, who taught local history, described how windows rattled on windy days and how sometimes the sound of a piano came at midnight when the Harrington parlor held no instrument at all. Investigators brought in Dr. Alan Price, a forensic consultant, who explained the case to reporters in measured, careful sentences. He said that the pattern of wounds suggested one assailant moving with purpose and without panic. June Mercer, the reporter, wrote that the community felt exposed and wronged, and this led to a cluster of contradictory reports. A retired sailor named Pete Collins swore he saw a woman in white standing at the bay on the night of the fire, while a grocer named Mark Ellis said he heard an argument inside the house 2 streets away, the kind of argument that ends with keys thrown and doors slammed. The Harrington house became famous as a place where the varnish on the banister would flake in patterns that resembled fingerprints, and where visiting mediums reported visions of a girl with burned hands. A short exchange recorded by a medium in 1969 shows a conversation between the medium and an alleged spirit. Medium says, "I see you by the window." The spirit answers with a breathy voice, "Let me in." Medium asks, "Who are you?" The spirit says, "I am the watching one." And the medium falters, describing a cold that entered the room and left a taste like iron. Next, we travel west to a farmhouse in Marlow County, Texas, where the Alvarez house, named for the family who had lived there for generations, became ground zero for a modern crime and an accompanying wave of reports of inexplicable occurrences. In 1987, the Alvarez matriarch, Rosa Alvarez, was found dead in the pantry, a blunt instrument nearby, and the community responded with both fear and suspicion. The Alvarez backstory runs in 3 short paragraphs that show resilience, migration, and private grief. The family had moved to Texas from southern New Mexico after droughts destroyed crops. Rosa, being the youngest of 5 children, had learned carpentry and then turned to homemaking. She smelled of talc and fresh bread and kept a silver locket hidden in a jam jar. Her husband Manuel brewed coffee in a percolator and kept the radio tuned to baseball games. Their children grew up in a house that had a loose stair and a well out back. Rosa had been active in the church and ran a small sewing circle, and strangers who came to town noted the house's bright yellow door. On the night of her death, a neighbor, Sam Bennett, who had once been invited to their kitchen table, said he heard a scream that made his dog howl, and within hours the county line was dotted with police cars and worry. Investigators found a bloody smear on the back door and a quarter-sized hair fiber clumped with pine sap in the pantry. Forensics later ran hair and found it belonged to someone of the Alvarez family not present in the house at the time, and the DNA profile suggested a person who had recently arrived from outside the county. The Alvarez case introduced public controversy because activists alleged that the initial police approach was biased and incomplete, while others insisted on a more mundane explanation, a robbery turned violent. Police body camera dialogue from the arrest of a suspect shows brief exchanges, now extended in witness interviews over the years to create texture, an interaction where an officer asked, "Where were you the night of the 12th?" The suspect replied, "I was at home." The officer pressed, "Did anyone see you?" The suspect said, "My sister was asleep." The officer said, "We found fibers on her shawl like yours." The suspect gasped, "That is not mine." In the months after, visitors to the Alvarez house reported lights flickering in the sewing room, a spool of thread unspooling itself in the middle of the night, and some claimed to have smelled Rosa's cologne, though the laundromat 2 blocks over confirmed the scent had not been stocked for years. The first 3 houses close with a lingering sense of unease that invites participation. If these stories make your skin prickle, you are not alone, and we want to hear from you. Which of these first 3 houses would you approach at night if you had to, and why? Tell us by commenting with the number and a short reason. For example, type 1 Whitaker, because I could not resist a locked floorboard. Comments help build community knowledge and sometimes lead to local tips we could not otherwise find, and your experiences may have been seen by neighbors who have never spoken publicly. If you are nervous about sharing publicly, you can begin with a one-line answer. We read everything and treat reports with care because many of these homes touch real lives and real families. Now that we have collected your thoughts, we will press deeper into cases where official accounts and public memory collide with each other, and where investigators noted anomalies in physical evidence and witness testimony. We move now to the second grouping of houses, where controversy followed every new claim, starting with a Victorian gabled home in the industrial outskirts of Erie, Pennsylvania, called the Blackwell House. The Blackwell case from 1962 involves a murder with an apparent motive that could not explain certain traces left behind. The family patriarch, Walter Blackwell, was a mill foreman who kept ties to union leaders and a ledger of grievances hidden under a floorboard in his office. His wife, Agnes, who liked lavender soap, was found on the staircase with a neck wound and a peculiar symbol carved into the banister wood. Investigators cataloged the symbol as not matching known gang markings in the region, and it took years for a linguist to propose that it resembled a variant of a Masonic cipher used in a private lodge across state lines. That claim made headlines and invited conspiracy theories.
Forensic detail noted small particles under Agnes's fingernails that matched grit from the mill floor and a smear of oil consistent with the type used in older machinery. Dr. Alan Price testified that the force required to produce the wound indicated deliberate intent rather than accidental fall. The Blackwell family backstory:
Walter had been a steady man who rose from boyhood in a tenement to a position of modest authority in the mill. He married Agnes in his early 20s and learned to dance at a community hall where they later hosted holiday dinners. Agnes taught piano at the parish and kept a small garden behind the house where she grew parsley and marigolds. Their son Eddie took to photography and often developed film in a dark room he built in the cellar, filling envelopes with images of shop windows and faces. The day after the crime, Eddie burned his negatives and would not say why to anyone. This detail became a fissure in the town rumor, and neighbors like Father Thomas, who had counseled the family, described the house as having a tension in its wood like the tightness of a string instrument. Dialogue reconstruction at the parish included 4 to 6 exchanges between Eddie and Father Thomas after the funeral. Father asks, "How are you holding up?" Eddie answers, "I am empty." Father says, "Do you want someone to come by?" Eddie replies, "Just not tonight." Father says, "We will pray." Eddie whispers, "I do not know how." The exchanges reveal a young man caught between grief and secrecy. A second controversial house in this block is the Marlowe Hotel in a sleepy railroad town in Oregon, where in 1999 a disgruntled former porter set a room on fire and one guest suffocated in the smoke, while the next occupant swore that the same room refused to stay dark and reported footsteps in the hall at 2 in the morning. The hotel had once been a speakeasy and had more than its share of quiet deaths and improvised burials under floorboards. Records show that the mortuary took only a single unidentified body from the blaze, and that the hotel ledger contained a note in a shaky hand that read, "Go while you can." The hotel property was inspected by Inspector Emily Cho, who found soot patterns inconsistent with typical fire spread, suggesting an accelerant poured along baseboards rather than a spontaneous ignition. Forensic description in 300 characters, accessible and plausible, explains that burn patterns and residue testing indicated a light petroleum-based accelerant was present, and that heat signatures suggested a second source of ignition near the doorway, indicating deliberate arson. Testimony from guests included vivid sensory impressions: sound of a key turning when no key was present, warmth crawling along the skin despite winter air outside, and the bitter tang of smoke inside a room that had no recent fire damage. On a late summer night in 2005, a guest named Daniel Reed recorded an exchange with the night clerk. Daniel says, "I heard someone at my door." Clerk replies, "Nobody has that room tonight." Daniel asks, "Are you sure?" Clerk answers, "Yes, closed since the fire." Daniel says, "Then who was outside?" Secondary characters emerge across these stories, adding texture and local color. Among them are Sheriff Mark Harlow, the steady lawman who keeps a notebook of impressions; June Mercer, the investigative reporter who follows file boxes and interviews; Rosa Alvarez, the grieving neighbor turned activist; Dr. Alan Price, the pragmatic forensic consultant who insists on method over myth; Emily Cho, the inspector with a background in arson patterns; Father Thomas, the local priest who hears confessions about seeing things that cannot be explained; Lydia Quinn, the historian who keeps bound newspaper clippings and small boxes of artifacts; and Sam Bennett, the neighbor who once trespassed and later regretted what he saw in the dark. Each of these people has a voice, and in the more controversial cases, they often disagree. The third house of this block sits on a bluff outside Portland, Maine, called the Larkin House, where in 1974 a visiting college student named Teresa Larkin vanished in the night after a party. The police found signs of a struggle in the kitchen, a half-opened refrigerator door, a shoe on the porch, and a smear of blood on the threshold. The Larkin family backstory is 3 paragraphs illustrating a family of hosts, open to visitors, who nevertheless had more secrets than they admitted. The patriarch, Martin Larkin, ran a hardware store and served on the town council. His wife, Elaine, baked pies for the library fundraiser, and the house brimmed with volunteers and drafted letters. Teresa was spirited and sharp, studying literature and telling stories while the adults argued about zoning laws.
After her disappearance, the family tried to keep the shop open as if routine could steady them, but their shutters remained closed for weeks. Witnesses came forward with partial accounts, and the neighbors described the porch light as blinking even in daylight hours, and a person who claimed to be a friend of Teresa said they had heard a song that night, the melancholy of which later appeared in graffiti under a bridge near the river. Police logs show interviews with a man named Carl who said he saw someone near the river with Teresa's scarf, and a woman named Helen who swore she heard Teresa call for help as she walked past the house to her mailbox. Dialogue at the police station between the detective and Carl shows 3 expanded exchanges recorded in the log. Detective says, "Where did you see them?" Carl answers, "Near the pier by the old warehouse." Detective asks, "Was there anyone else there?" Carl says, "No one I could see, but lights." These contradictions left the case unresolved, and overnight myths about seeing a white dress in the river and hearing a hum from under the floorboards began to spread. After the CTA and these 3 cases, we move into the third block of houses, which serve as a narrative pivot toward more intense and visceral moments of evidence and reported phenomena. The 4th house is an old farmhouse known as Fox Hollow, tucked into a valley in Virginia, where in
2001, a backyard dig uncovered human remains that would rewrite local history. The discovery came about when a new owner, Thomas Greer, decided to build a shed and hit what he called a bone. The remains were later identified through dental records and historical comparison as belonging to a family named Kellerman who had gone missing in 1953. The Kellerman backstory reads 3 paragraphs that show migration, fading industry, and a string of small tragedies. The Kellermans moved to Virginia seeking work in textile mills. They had 4 children and a habit of keeping jars of jam labeled with dates and their lives mapped in ledgers filled with loans. In the summer of 1953, the family disappeared from public records and the house was sold at auction. For decades, people thought the family had moved away, but the 2001 excavation revealed a cache of letters under the floor and a set of burial shrouds crudely fashioned from curtains. The village reacted with horror, and the discovery was followed by an obsessive sequence of interviews and re-examinations of files. The forensic process in the Fox Hollow case involved anthropology and careful excavation. Forensic description in 300 characters, clear and accessible, notes that osteological analysis identified perimortem trauma inconsistent with animal scavenging, and soil stratigraphy around the remains suggested the burials had been made quickly and then covered, with small artifacts like buttons included that helped date the deposition. Photographs of the items were published in local newspapers, and some triggered a new generation of myths about a farmhouse that kept people inside with a hush. The excavation also uncovered a lacquered music box that when wound played a single cheery tune, and several visitors reported that at night the same tune could be heard faintly as if the box had been turned by invisible hands. One tension moment of 500 to 600 characters follows in 2 paragraphs and is about the day the bones were found and the town gathered. Men in rumpled shirts and women with hands over mouths leaned over the pit. The smell of damp earth and kerosene filled the air, and a child touched a small bone and whimpered, her fingers trembling as if feeling the heat of someone else. The adults argued over what to do, some wanting to cover the hole and forget, others wanting to dig until they found every secret. At dusk, the music box tone rose and fell, and someone said they saw a figure by the tree line, a dark silhouette that neither moved nor spoke. The second tension moment centers on a late-night search of the cellar where a witness reported footsteps and a pressure on the chest. Again, in 2 paragraphs and about 500 to 600 characters combined, the searchers with flashlights spoke in clipped sentences, their breath visible in the cold. A thud from below made them freeze, and one man, Tom Greer, felt his lungs tighten as if someone beside him had leaned in to whisper.
"You still looking?" Their flashlights lit only dust and empty crates, but the pressure remained like an insistence in the ribs. Next, we move to House 5, an elegant colonial in the suburbs of Charleston, South Carolina, known locally as the Darrow Place, where a high-profile murder in 1978 ended in a trial that split the city along wealth lines.
The victim was a young socialite named Vivian Darrow, found in the conservatory with signs of asphyxia and a silk ribbon tangled at her throat. The trial named a boyfriend as suspect and produced conflicting testimony, and the house acquired a reputation for a presence that rearranged flowers in the conservatory and left wet footprints on windowsills. The Darrow backstory is 3 paragraphs portraying opulence and brittle appearances. Vivian grew up with private tutors and summer trips north. She kept shells on her bedroom window and wrote thin notes to friends about feeling watched. Her parents hosted salons where wine and arguments flowed in equal measure, and the house always smelled faintly of citrus from the conservatory. After her death, the family moved out the following year, leaving a piano in the parlor. Musicians who played that piano later reported its middle strings bending and releasing in a way that suggested a finger pressing and then vanishing. In the civic debate, Reverend Thomas organized candlelight vigils, and a reporter named June Mercer covered the case with a cautious pen, noting the way grief can split towns. The 6th house in this block is a ranch-style home on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona, called the Sunvale Residence, where in 1995 a family was murdered and the sole surviving child claimed the house would not allow him to sleep without hearing the voices of the dead. The surviving child, Michael Sears, is now an adult who holds an interview with a reporter in which he speaks softly and at length. Michael's backstory is 3 paragraphs that show a boy who learned to be vigilant and to read small cues. He remembers the smell of frying onions before dawn, the way his mother would hum as if calibrating the air, and the way his father took the assembly of a radio apart into pieces and hid some screws under a loose board. On the night of the murders, Michael hid in a crawlspace and later described hearing a conversation outside that spoke of money and betrayal, the kind of adult arguments that disintegrate into violence. The police found a torn map with routes marked and a single shotgun shell in the gutter. Forensics indicated contusions consistent with a struggle, and a DNA swab taken from under a fingernail did not match any local records. The family home then became a place reported to be cold in the center of summer and to have the smell of onions lingering in rooms long after the stove had been cleaned. At this midpoint of the narrative, the investigations move to cases where
the accumulation of oddities forces authorities to slow their pace and account for the inexplicable. In Block C, we escalate toward the most unsettling reports and physical evidence that persuaded some investigators to say this is no longer only about criminals and more about places that collect pain. House 7 is an ornate Queen Anne in a coastal town called Velisa, named for the tree line that once framed the lane, where in 1913 an axe murder claimed the lives of a family with small children and made the house infamous as a site of horror. The Velisa house backstory is 3 paragraphs describing the family dynamics that preceded the tragedy. The patriarch Elias Gray had a temper rumored among neighbors. His wife Margaret kept a careful ledger of household goods and a stash of coins beneath a loose stair, and the children were known to play until dusk in the orchard. On a summer night, voices turned into a commotion, and a neighbor named Artie woke to a sound like someone dragging a trunk across a porch. The next morning, the Gray family was found dead with blows consistent with a bladed instrument, and the axe found in the shed had a handle that fit a missing notch on Elias' workbench. The town built a narrative of motive and madness, some saying Elias had been taken by a fit of rage, others accusing a transient laborer who had been seen in the area. Witness testimonies, however, grew strange. A woman named Eleanor, who had walked her dog past the orchard in the days after, said she saw a child at the window banging a spoon in rhythm, while a worker at the mill swore he felt a hand on his shoulder, though no one was there. The Velisa house is one of the moments the audience will find hardest to forget, with a reported physical finding that made national headlines in the 1950s. A group of teenagers broke an upstairs window as a dare and claimed they found small handprints on the inside of the glass that could not be washed away with soap, as if the substance was embedded in the very molecules of the pain. A tension moment here of 500 to 600 characters in 2 paragraphs recounts the day a group attempted to photograph the interiors and the film developed, showing a pale smudge in the doorway shaped like a person, while the photographers later reported hearing the sound of a lullaby and feeling cold breath on their necks. House 8 is a clapboard cottage on the outskirts of Detroit, Michigan, where in 2007 the Fox Hollow discovery and a previously untouched trunk in the attic connected disparate cases. The attic trunk contained journal entries that mentioned other houses, names, and odd rituals. The cottage had been home to a woman known as Agnes Moore, who kept a garden of tall fennel and reportedly burned herbs in the fireplace to ward off pests. Her death was ruled accidental, but the journal entries suggest she feared for her family and wrote of footsteps at night. The cottage backstory is 3 paragraphs, presenting Agnes as a widowed woman who collected newspaper clippings and odd coins. She had worked as a seamstress in factories during the war and later tutored neighborhood children. Her voice in the journal is measured, then panicked, and she writes of doors closing with a purpose. The community responded with curiosity and apprehension. House 9 sits near a reservoir in the Appalachians, a 2-story farmhouse called the Holloway Place, where in 1982 a series of break-ins culminated in the murder of a visiting priest who had come to counsel a family. The Holloway family had a long line of caretakers for the local church and were known by Elder Ruth, who lived next door, as both generous and quick to quiet any rumor. The Holloway backstory in 3 paragraphs shows a family that kept the town together in small ways, hosting potlucks and providing casseroles for new mothers. Their home was a hub of community life and had a carved mantle that bore initials from each generation. The murder of the priest was brutal and public, and the case was complicated by a confession that was later recanted. Investigators noted scratches on the interior door that suggested someone had tried to keep it closed, as if the murderer had been battling to get out. At this high point of tension, 2 moments are described in 500 to 600 characters each. One about the day the priest was found, and another about a late-night vigil where candles went out in an instant. The priest's body was located in the small pantry, and the candlelight flickered and then vanished, leaving the whole room cold and smelling of rosemary and iron. After these scenes, we move to the final block of houses, where re-examinations, reversals, and little triumphs of closure mix with stubborn mysteries. House 10 is an urban brownstone in Baltimore, known as the Martin House, where a string of violent incidents over 2 decades culminated in a murder that was caught on a neighbor's security camera and yet still left questions. The Martin backstory is 3 paragraphs, showing a family of tenants and the building's slow descent into neglect. Tenants changed, voices rose at odd hours, and a vacuum of responsibility allowed illicit activity to flourish. The cited footage captured a shadow moving through a corridor, doors slamming, and then one figure collapsing on the stairs. The footage also captured a phrase being whispered that neighbors later repeated to investigators, a syllable that had no clear meaning but was repeated at other houses in different states. Forensics at this point took on a more modern tack, with DNA swabs, fibers, and stain analysis conducted by county labs. Forensic explanation about modern methods in 300 characters notes that DNA profiles are compared against national databases, that luminol can reveal blood traces invisible to the naked eye, and that fiber analysis can link clothing to specific looms. That level of technical work altered how many of these cases could be revisited and sometimes reopened. House 11 is a plantation-era house converted into a bed and breakfast in Louisiana called the Marlowe Estate, where a guest was found dead in 2010, and the case opened questions about what guests reported during their stays. Some guests reported waking to a hand on their shoulder, others reported cold spots and a bitter scent near the back stairs. The plantation backstory is 3 paragraphs that trace ownership, economic shifts, and public rituals that left gaps in knowledge. The house had been used for films, for ghost tours, and once hosted a reading by a poet whose work later referenced the estate in an elegy. After the 2010 death, many argued that the house had been commodified and that profit had overtaken prudence. The final house on our tour, House 12, is an unassuming duplex in a mid-Atlantic city where in 2018 a couple was murdered and neighbors complained of nightly sounds like scraping and a whispering that came from the thin walls.
The duplex backstory is 3 paragraphs revealing migration to the city, work in service industries, and the struggle to hold down a home while caring for aged parents. The couple had been seen arguing in the days before their deaths and left a series of messages on their phone that investigators preserved. Their voicemail messages included an exchange where the woman apologized 3 times and the man said she did not have to, which later sounded like an ominous rehearsal of goodbye. At trial, a neighbor named Mark Ellis testified about hearing furniture move at odd hours and later retracted his statement. But June Mercer had already printed his quote, and the retraction complicated the record. Across these final cases, a pattern emerges and then dissipates. Some houses show evidence of outside intruders, others point to domestic violence, and a few stubbornly resist explanation. Experts vary in their conclusions. Dr. Alan Price cautions against over-reliance on anecdote. He reminds listeners that cold spots can be explained by poor insulation, and that the taste of metal in the mouth can follow anxiety and adrenaline. Father Thomas and Lydia Quinn note that communities need stories to process grief, that legends form around trauma like ice around a branch. Yet the accumulation of certain phenomena repeats at multiple properties, such as doors closing without wind, odors without a source, and impressions on photographic film that defy simple explanation. Throughout, dialogues between investigators and families were often terse and painfully human. A typical exchange in a DNA cold case review includes 3 to 5 moving back and forth lines. The investigator asking, "What was the last day you saw them?" A relative answering, "Saturday afternoon." The investigator asking, "Did you notice anything different?" The relative replying, "She had been quieter than usual." The investigator saying, "We will take this step."
Closer by closer, the relative whispering, "Please find them." The narrative converges on possible explanations, which include psychological stress, serial offenders moving anonymously through the countryside, accidental deaths misinterpreted, and, for some, a place-based persistence we identify as haunting. The conclusion cannot be total in either direction. Some houses were restored and repurposed, others were left to rot and finally demolished, and a few still stand empty with notices from municipal authorities. In the Martin House case, a new analysis of fibers led investigators to a match with a textile mill, and a suspect was charged in a decade-old murder after additional witness testimony came forward, a rare instance where physical evidence and renewed investigation yielded legal closure. In contrast, the Whitaker and Valisa tragedies maintain no arrests, and the houses retain the aura of unresolved pain. The epilogue unfolds in 3 time moments that show aftermath and the slow, strange ways lives continue. 1 month after the last case closed, some families found small comforts in routine. They returned to the table and made soup on an ordinary stove. A neighbor repainted a fence, and the local paper published a column asking about the responsibility towns carry for their own histories. 3 months later, a community meeting convened to discuss how to prevent future tragedies. A committee formed to review safety measures, and a historian like Lydia Quinn began cataloging oral histories so the voices of those affected would not evaporate. At 6 months, a few houses had volunteers cleaning yards. Some families had moved on, new owners had installed lights and cameras, and others actively avoided the locations altogether. The total epilogue in these 3 parts adds up to a precise accounting of how time changes perception and sometimes heals, while also preserving a thread of the original disturbance. In 1 month, the immediate shock softens into a practical grief. In 3 months, policy and memory begin to shape how a town tells the story. And in 6 months, the physical traces are altered, repainted, reconstructed, or raised, but the memory persists in conversations, in odd smells when a door opens, and in the sense some houses have that they carry their stories with them. In the end, we are left with questions that cannot be fully answered here. Some evidence supports a judicial narrative,
Others invite a folkloric reading, and many details remain stubbornly inexplicable. The walls in these houses still whisper, and sometimes those whispers become words in the mouths of witnesses and in the margins of police reports. If you have walked past a property and felt the air go colder under your bones, if you have a photograph with a smudge you cannot explain, reach out in the comments and tell us what you know. Share numbers or short notes about where you have been. Your account can be part of how communities piece together half-remembered facts. If these stories moved you, subscribe to follow investigations that try to balance respect for
Victims with clear-eyed analysis of evidence. We aim to bring documents, interviews, and forensic context to each case, and you will find source material and links in the description if you want to read further. As the camera pulls back from the last house, remember that some doors remain closed because they must be, and others remain closed because someone still sits behind them keeping watch. The houses we have visited are a map of human choices and of the ways places remember us, and perhaps the most unsettling thought is that memory does not always rest in the living. It sometimes lingers in paint and plank and the low hum of the heating when the lights are out. The walls still whisper, and they ask us to listen.